In the final days of January 2026, a familiar sense of unease returned to the Middle East. For weeks, the region had been drifting toward instability, but now the signals were unmistakable. Military movements accelerated, diplomatic language hardened, and the world's most powerful actors began positioning themselves for a confrontation that no one publicly claimed to want, yet many privately prepared for. At the center of this moment stood the President of the United States. Speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One, Donald Trump chose his words carefully, but their meaning was clear. He described a vast concentration of American naval power moving toward the Middle East, emphasizing that it was intended as a warning, not necessarily an announcement of war. Yet the implication was impossible to ignore. The United States was signaling that it was prepared to act, decisively and overwhelmingly, if events continued on their current trajectory. Behind that statement lay a concrete military reality. Far from Washington, deep in the Indian Ocean, a U.S. aircraft carrier strike group had already altered course. The nuclear-powered USS Abraham Lincoln, one of the most formidable warships ever constructed, was steaming westward. A floating city of steel, aircraft, and firepower, the carrier was accompanied by guided missile destroyers equipped with long-range cruise missiles capable of striking targets hundreds of kilometers inland. Below the surface, attack submarines moved silently alongside the formation, their presence officially unacknowledged but widely assumed. Together, these vessels represented one of the most concentrated displays of American maritime power in years. Such movements are never accidental. Carrier strike groups do not change course on a whim, and they are not deployed merely to send messages, unless those messages are intended to be understood clearly by adversaries. For military planners in Tehran, Jerusalem, Riyadh, and Doha, the meaning was unmistakable. The United States was re-entering the regional equation in force. This escalation did not occur in isolation. It unfolded against a backdrop of extraordinary instability inside Iran itself. By January 2026, Iran was no longer merely a strategic rival or diplomatic problem. It had become the epicenter of multiple overlapping crises: economic collapse, internal unrest, and unresolved military confrontation with both Israel and the United States. The Iranian leadership understood that external pressure and internal dissent were beginning to reinforce each other. Years of sanctions had weakened the economy. A brief but destructive war months earlier had damaged critical infrastructure and confidence alike. Now protests, initially sparked by economic despair, threatened to challenge the regime's authority more directly than at any point in decades. From Washington's perspective, this convergence created both danger and opportunity. Donald Trump had built much of his foreign policy on the idea of leverage. Pressure applied visibly and relentlessly until an opponent either conceded or collapsed. In Iran, he saw a government weakened by its own decisions and increasingly isolated from its population. The movement of the carrier strike group was not merely about deterrence. It was about reminding Tehran that its margin for error was shrinking rapidly. Yet Trump's approach also carried significant risks. A miscalculation could ignite a regional war drawing in Israel, the Gulf states, and potentially global powers dependent on energy flows through the Strait of Hormuz. American military bases across the Middle East lay within range of Iranian missiles. Oil infrastructure, shipping lanes, and civilian populations could all become targets in a rapid escalation. This was the balance Trump sought to exploit, applying pressure without crossing the threshold into open war. American allies in the region reacted swiftly. At Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the largest U.S. military installation in the Middle East, precautionary measures began almost immediately. Non-essential personnel were quietly evacuated. Air defenses were reinforced. Coordination centers were expanded in anticipation of possible missile attacks. British forces followed suit. London announced the deployment of fighter aircraft to the Gulf, officially describing the move as defensive. In practice, these aircraft were capable of striking targets deep inside Iranian territory if required. The message to Tehran was layered but unmistakable. Any attack on American or Allied assets would be met with an integrated, multinational response. For Gulf states such as Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Oman, the situation was deeply unsettling. They stood geographically closest to the fault line, and they knew that retaliation, if it came, would likely fall on their cities, bases, and energy infrastructure before it reached Washington or New York. As a result, diplomatic channels worked overtime. Gulf leaders urged restraint, warning that escalation could unleash consequences no one could fully control. One of the most striking elements of this period was Israel's relative quiet. In previous confrontations, Israeli leaders had often spoken loudly and frequently, emphasizing red lines and military readiness. This time, the public rhetoric was muted. Observers described it as strategic silence. Privately, however, Israeli planners were far from inactive. Israel's leadership understood that Iran's internal turmoil and Trump's pressure campaign created a unique moment. Any overt Israeli threats risked uniting Iranians around their government at a moment when domestic anger was already eroding the regime's legitimacy. Silence, paradoxically, served Israel's interests better than provocation. Behind closed doors, military preparations continued. On the evening of January 8, 2026, the Islamic Republic executed a move it had reserved for moments of extreme danger. Iran went dark. Mobile networks collapsed. Internet access vanished. International phone lines were severed. In a country of nearly 90 million people, communication, both internal and external, was abruptly cut off. The blackout was more comprehensive than those imposed during earlier unrest, signaling that the state was preparing for an operation conducted entirely beyond public scrutiny. What followed emerged only in fragments: satellite connections, encrypted messages, and whispered phone calls that briefly slipped through the blackout painted a picture of extraordinary violence. Security forces opened fire on crowds with live ammunition. Snipers appeared on rooftops. Streets that had been filled with chants hours earlier were suddenly littered with bodies. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors reported waves of gunshot victims, many with wounds to the head and chest. Evidence of deliberate, lethal force. In some areas, medical facilities were surrounded by security forces to prevent information from leaking. Bodies were removed without records. Families were warned not to ask questions. Within days, estimates of the death toll climbed rapidly. First hundreds, then thousands. Human rights organizations, relying on hospital data and witness testimony, warned that a mass killing was underway. Iranian activists in exile issued urgent appeals, describing an organized campaign to crush dissent permanently. As the scale of the violence became clear, attention shifted to the United States. President Trump responded with unusually direct warnings. He publicly threatened military action if the killings continued, framing American power as a shield for civilians rather than a tool of regime change. Behind the scenes, his statement sent shockwaves through Tehran. Iranian officials later admitted that Washington's rhetoric triggered panic at senior levels of government. The leadership feared that the crackdown, rather than restoring control, might invite foreign intervention. Yet Trump hesitated. Allies urged restraint. Gulf states warned of retaliation that would strike their cities first. Military planners cautioned that U.S. forces were not yet optimally positioned to absorb a counterattack. On January 16th, Trump announced that he would not order strikes, for now. He insisted that he had achieved results through pressure alone. In Tehran, the message was interpreted differently. The regime concluded that it had survived the danger. By late January 2026, the immediate crisis had passed. The protests were crushed. The regime survived. The armada did not strike, yet nothing was settled. Iran's economy remained in collapse. Inflation surged, daily life grew harsher, and political legitimacy had evaporated, replaced by fear and repression. Control endured, but only by force. The United States kept pressure but faced limits. Israel stayed alert. Regional powers hovered between deterrence and disaster. The question was no longer if confrontation would come, but when. For ordinary Iranians, the cost was already paid. Their fate now lay in decisions made far beyond their streets. And toward the Persian Gulf, the USS Abraham Lincoln continued its course, armed, ready, waiting.